My name is Cole Flottman, and I am presenting my paper, Antiquification as a Rhetoric in Language Endangerment Popular Media. What you'll see today is a brief typology of sorts, a qualitative study of a number of related strategies and word usages that I've noticed over the past few years just in consuming this media. And based on conversations that I've had with friends and colleagues, I don't think that it's an uncommon one. Obviously, it can be very difficult to quantify the prevalence of a rhetorical strategy. Regardless of the type of media that you are consuming, I do think that it shows up. So what am I talking about when I say antiquification, which, by the way, is a term I'm not particularly this refers to highlighting or foregrounding a language's age in order to grant it some kind of prestige. This often involves an explicit comparison between another language or between notions of. And before I get into how exactly this manifests itself, I do think I should mention where this is coming, both the pattern and this paper. Because I think it's fair to say that we are in a period of heightened awareness and action towards the issue of language engagement. Obviously, it's an issue that has defined the linguistic landscape for several hundred years. The field of academic linguistics has really only started to codify certain behaviors, practices, and priorities towards the issue within the past few decades. And alongside this awareness is, of course, coming discourse and discussion. And to that end, in the 90s and 2000s, there were a number of very high-profile works, volumes and articles written by prominent linguists calling for the field to take more attention and pay more attention to this issue. And they make very compelling, persuasive cases towards the issue. And alongside this, and over the past 20 years, 30 years, has of course been news media, who is also talking about the issue, who might not have that academic understanding. I'm both talking about individual language projects, but also the issue as a whole. Oftentimes in this framing, is this an issue? Yes. But just because we have additional discourse surrounding the issue does not mean that all of that discourse equally serves the communities that are affected by the issue. And I do want to say equally serve. And I am not saying explicitly things harmful. Because I don't think I want this paper or any of this discussion to be scolding. And I don't think that any individual author or rhetoric, the use of rhetoric, is necessarily harmful. However, Jane Hill in 2002 identified three rhetorics that are commonly used by academic linguists when talking about language endangerment that she thought did not necessarily match with how communities individually thought of their own language. Because unfortunately, discourse can unintentionally reflect or inflect ideology that we have about language. Jennifer Davis in 2013 had a spiritual successor article to this, identifying three additional rhetorics, again, that she thought were very common, used by linguists and by media, talking about the issue. Again, these are well-meaning pieces, but some of these individual rhetorics might not match with how communities view their language. To that end, this is a spiritual successor to both of them, trying to just identify and talk about this one rhetoric that I've noticed. So we're back to talking about antiquification, language age, which can be a fuzzy topic to talk about. Because generally, in the field of linguistics, when we talk about timescales, it's generally in relation to very specific features of language. We can talk about a diachronic sound change, or we can talk about the emergence of a new lexical item. Or we can talk about it in a very abstract way, in terms of the emergence of human language. But generally, we don't try to classify languages based on their age. This does not necessarily match up with a popular conception of language. Even inside the field, we're struggling to deal with this idea of languages as very discrete objects. And in the popular conceptions, languages are these individual objects that have defined beginning and end points. So I think a lot of this rhetoric is fueled by a number of different conflations that people make between language and the properties of language. Of course, one of these is writing. It's frequently in the case of these large listicles of the oldest languages You might see Sumerian can be considered the oldest language. And this is a conflation between a language's historical written record and a language's actual age, whatever that means. And obviously, we know that writing as a technology is predated by language by tens of thousands of years. And in addition, many languages, of course, have never had a long written tradition or have only very recently acquired it. And so extrapolating from this to claim that these languages don't have any age is of course, it's kind of bizarre. And we also talk about some languages sometimes in terms of the divergence points, especially within a family. So if Latin is the ancestor of Spanish and French, then those languages, of course, can't be any older than when we say older Latin diverged. Of course, the points at which they diverged are fuzzy, and the Latin never really stopped being spoken. In addition, these languages sometimes don't inherit the history of those languages, and so Spanish is not usually said to be 6,000 or 8,000 years old or European. But in addition, sometimes languages are considered as old as their families. So sometimes we can talk about the time scale of Afro-Asiatic as a language family, sometimes appearing as old as 40,000 years. But even when we discuss those timescales, we understand that that is not necessarily a claim on the emergence of language, and that also language could have existed before that. And in addition, these sorts of judgments about language families are estimates and also very heavily based on the evidence that we have. And another conflation sometimes occurs with the arrival to an area, or when a language is perceived as being in a new region of the world. So along these types of oldest languages lists, you'll find young language lists which frequently include Afrikaans because they diverged from Dutch when it South Africa. Obviously, Dutch and Afrikaans both kind of diverge from common ancestors. And in addition, when a language is arriving to an area, it frequently doesn't inherit, again, this historical record of the language before it. And I think this kind of conflation has a lot of ramifications for how we view languages in the Pacific. Does Hawaiian count as being a couple thousand years old, or does it acquire all of the history of Austronesian? Again, these are all sorts of fictions that take place that aren't really based on any linguistic evidence. And so one of the ways that this actually manifests itself is, of course, age-marked language, words that carry a sense of antiquity about them based on how they're used. And one of these words that immediately stands out is a word like primitive, which I think can be said to have these kind of very strong connotations in opposition to contemporary times. We can only use it in terms of proto-people, primitive tools, primitive language would fall under this category. And in 2011, the Association of Social Anthropologists actually put out a statement decrying the use of primitive as a descriptor for contemporary people groups. They said that this places groups as frozen in space and time. And I think this framing from a related field to linguistics offers a very good framing for how to view this type of rhetoric in any way that it's manifesting. Because, of course, cultures alongside languages are not static. They're constantly evolving, both in modern times with every individual, but also over the thousands of years, over the course of, once again, what we call language age. Fortunately, I don't think I found as many examples of this still being used to describe languages that are still being used. Another term that did stand out as being very prevalent was this term ancient. So ancient language it's commonly used to describe a number of different varieties, regardless of whether they're spoken or not. Again, the 65,000-year link to one of the oldest cultures, which once again, how do we find the age of a culture? One of the most ancient languages. Again, ancient does carry a sense of being very old in opposition to contemporary times. So I wanted to check like how this is being used by these different outlets, and does this actually carry a sense of so I did a quick search based on the search terms that I had available to me in the search engines of some of the most popular news print outlets in the US and checked their websites for how many times ancient language was actually used. And I found 323 examples overall, and 109 of those examples were applied to contemporary people groups and contemporary languages. So as a whole, most of the time, these were applied to languages that are no longer spoken, whether that's a period of a language like Latin or languages that have truly gone silent, like Elamite. But for about a third of these languages, the instances, they are applied to contemporary people. And so I think this pattern kind of indicates that this does have some sense of being older, regardless of if that's actually what is being used in individual instances. In addition, I wanted to check where this is being applied. And so I mapped a quick number of these instances, and I wanted to highlight a couple of notes. So one, there are a number of minority languages on the list. If you look, you'll see a cluster around Europe. Those are a lot of the Celtic languages and minority languages. Of course, there are a lot of indigenous languages around the world, but there are also a couple of points, things like Tamil and Telugu, or Cantonese and Mandarin, or Arabic, that make their way onto the list, these non-endangered languages that are probably due to the conflations discussed earlier being called ancient. What is not represented in this sample, at least, are world languages, world European languages like Spanish, French, German. For whatever reason, these languages do not appear in the sample. And I think that is an important point, because sometimes the word ancient language can be used to exotify a language outside of necessarily age mark. To this end, sometimes I found instances where this term ancient language was used without any even identification of the language. So it can't be tied to a specific people group because it's not even being given a name. Whether this is being done out of ignorance or what have you, it's clear that sometimes this is being used to mystify a language. Another way that this arises is in terms of explicit age comparisons. So calling one language older than another. Obviously, those listicles that I mentioned earlier are rife with this, and in fact, that's highly the point. But it can manifest in other articles as well. So sometimes this is used to be decrying one language over another. English makes no sense as a vessel for non-scientific knowledge because of the young language, lacks the elegance. Cantonese is an older and it's more pure form of language. Meaning of words not developed. I mean, you can see that the languages that this is being applied to are not disenfranchised languages in terms of English or Mandarin. But it does create this explicit chronology that, of course, is not based in linguistic evidence. And you also have to question whether we want, whether it's a good thing for languages to be competing in terms of what they can or cannot do based on perceived language age. Because when you expand this timetable, of course, you run into other things besides English that are often called new, things like pidgins and creoles. Light Walpuri or other creoles can sometimes be called very new languages. And so by talking about young languages as not maybe being elegant or suitable for the world, I think it calls into question how we are talking about creoles, which are, of course, very disenfranchised. So I think that this interacts in a way that should be noted and at least considered when discussing language. So another way that this manifests itself is, of course, how suitable is it in a modern age? And often this comes about in terms of talking about these language workshops where new vocabulary is created inside a language to talk about newer technologies. And it's often used in a way of we're actually having to bring a language into a modern time, into a modern era. One, it implies that this might be actually a difficult thing to do. And it also implies that it needs these specific vocabulary terms in order to be considered a modern language, and not just the fact that it exists and is being spoken by speakers who are, by definition, modern. There's an idea that these languages are ancient, and so that's what is making them need to establish a newer lexicon, and not based on their relationship to newer technologies, based on whether they've been allowed to create these different sorts of vocabularies. So I think this type of rhetoric, especially, can imply things about a language that aren't based in linguistic reality, especially if we're talking about all languages in terms of what we have evidence for being around the same age. Lastly, of course, there's just times where this ancientness of a language is foregrounded over concepts of modernity. So frequently, headlines will only include ancient language without specifically mentioning the language's age. And if you look at the bottom, you'll notice Aramaic, which showed up 13 times on my 109 instance sample, which is frequently given this moniker, language of Jesus. It's frequently called ancient language. Once again, this is tying the language specifically to the past. Obviously, very prominent figures might be mentioned when talking about the language that people don't know much about. But I think one of the issues is that frequently Aramaic is mentioned and called the language of Jesus without mention of any modern speakers. So they might not quote or even name individual people that are involved in using the language, or any indication the language has changed over the past several thousand years. Again, a lot of these instances really make the language a static entity. Right, so these things are frequently locked in place. So I do want to, end off with some qualifications for this study. So obviously, especially in that sample, we're talking about hundreds of authors over a 20-year period, and lots of different outlets. And I don't think any individual instances of this rhetoric is necessarily bad. However, I think it should be looked at whenever people are talking and characterizing individual languages, because does that characterization match with how the community uses it? And secondly, does that characterization say anything about other languages? Because I don't think that it's necessarily a goal of the field or of individual linguists to create these unnecessary ranking in people's minds. Because frequently, these individual articles might be the only time that people are exposed to these languages. And so by classifying them in relation to their age or maybe a static nature, it might imbue some of these notions of what antiquity is. So the LSA has a media guide that discusses how linguists can and should talk to news outlets and journalists. And I think this is a very good guide for people to take a look at. In addition, I think people should constantly be thinking about whose voices are being heard in these news articles. If you are being quoted, are community members being quoted, or are their conceptions of how they view their language being represented? Are you characterizing a language, or are you using characterizations that you've heard? These are just things to keep in mind all the time when talking to media. I do want to expand this kind of study further and just talking about how media uses different types of descriptors to apply to language. I wouldn't say that this one is ready yet in terms of releasing any like quantifiable data. Unfortunately, when talking about rhetoric, you can be really restricted by the particularities of individual search engines or search terms, as well as things like paywalls. And I think that concludes my presentation, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have.